As an advanced team of experts from the World Health Organization arrives in China to investigate the origins of COVID-19, where will they look? What are they looking for? And can the mission steer clear of politics? And a new UN report into the U.S. killing of Iranian Major General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad in January rejects U.S. claims they was acting in self-defense. As regulations for the use of combat drones are planned, how will the U.S. react? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. A World Health Organization advance team is in Beijing to begin a field mission to pave the way for a field mission into the origins of COVID-19. The two specialists in animal health and epidemiology are working with Chinese colleagues to determine the mission's scope. COVID-19 is believed to have emerged in a seafood market in Wuhan late last year, but U.S. President Donald Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo have claimed it originated in a laboratory without presenting evidence. The preliminary result comes as the U.S. begins withdrawing from the WHO. So what can we expect from it, and will politics interfere from either side? I'm joined via Skype by Eric Ding, an epidemiologist and health economist at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, and in the studio, current affairs commentator Einar Tangen. But first, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying regarding the arrival of the WHO team. Let's take a look.
A basic consensus between China and WHO is that virus tracing is a scientific issue that should be studied by scientists through international research and cooperation across the globe. It is also the view of WHO that it is an ongoing process, probably concerning many countries and localities, and WHO will conduct similar trips to other countries and regions in light of the actual need.
Upon the departure of the team on Friday, Andrew Bramberg, U.S. ambassador to the UN in Geneva, said that we expect that the CCP, meaning the Communist Party of China, will offer the team of scientists full access to data, samples, and localities, and look forward to this timely report. So, gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Let's start the discussion. In May, Chinese President Xi Jinping said during his address at a World Health Assembly meeting that we, meaning China, need to continue supporting global research by scientists on the source and transmission routes of the virus. So, Eric, what is really the international consensus or legal foundation, let's say, for this mission, and what is your understanding behind China's consent or China's actually initiative to also call for such a mission?
Well, I think there's many international bodies that have called for this investigation, inquiry into how it began, but it is an existing question of international concern because, A, how did we get here, and what can we learn about, in terms of the virus, in terms of the structure and potentially other treatments and cures. It is really important, and of course, how did the epidemic evolve so that we can prevent it next time? I think the international bodies should be involved. In addition with China, in working together to find this. It should not be led by any one single entity.
Well, actually, there was this World Health Assembly resolution which laid out the legal ground, the international consensus of countries for such a field mission. However, there have been several concepts that's been circulating. For instance, some Western countries had called for an so-called independent inquiry or investigation to be launched because of what they claim is China's lack of transparency on the issue in the early stages. China has rejected these claims, and such a mission has not gained any momentum. At this moment, we are looking at these field missions, which these experts are in Beijing to lay the groundwork for. And then we also have a global review that's planned at an appropriate time for the global reaction, the global response to COVID-19. So at least we're looking at two things, a global review and field missions to trace the origins of this virus. Einar, please help us understand the relationship between these two projects and how are they different? How are they expected to be played out?
All right, the field study is just purely scientific. They're coming here to figure out if it came from China, how it evolved, if it crossed species, if it came from bats or whatever. So that's completely separate from the review of the idea of how did governments respond to this and what are the appropriate steps necessary to deal with any future pandemic and such things. So these are completely different ideas. People are kind of conflagrating them, and that is not the way to go about this. This is purely scientific. The other one is going to be judgmental and to a certain extent scientific in the sense that they're trying to come up with best practices as governments go forward.
Eric, what is your understanding of the difference between basically the three concepts, a so-called independent inquiry, and then these field missions, and then there is also a review at appropriate time led by the World Health Organization to look at the global response to this virus?
Yeah, I'm more familiar with, in terms of the review of the global response. That one is led by Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand. And she was a mentor to Jacinda Ardern. So I think that inquiry will really get at how do we learn from the beginning in terms of what went wrong, what went right, and basically how we got here. And I think that one may be a little bit more political, and in terms of there's a lot more policies of potential finger pointing or potential finger wagging at certain governments and public health organizations. And in certain ways, I feel that one is the more important one at the current time. I think the field missions are also incredibly important. And I think the scientific investigations of those inquiries are important. But I think in terms of global response, it's all about how we respond because we can't always prevent every single outbreak that will emerge and new pandemics that might emerge.
Right.
So it's about how we respond and how we learn.
Yeah. So the field missions are a scientific project to find out about the where the virus originated, how it emerged from nature possibly, and how it jumped to human being. Eric, what can we expect from these preliminary field missions? What are some of the key questions they will try to answer?
Well, I think some of the key questions are like the specific virus or the genetic analysis of the phylogenetic tree of these different strains and how they can potentially diverge and also emerged from animal sources. And this is a really important question because there's many potential strains floating around in the world and how they jump from place to place. And I think how it jumped out of China is a question because we do know there are samples of this virus detected in France, in Spain, and Italy as early as December, and some say perhaps November 2019. And if that was true, then that means it might not have emerged from Wuhan. So that leads to a lot of questions.
Right. Well, we have actually seen media reports that wastewater sample, for instance, in a certain European country actually tested positive for COVID-19, and those samples were collected as early as March 2019. And also, there are people who came who were in the United States and who claim that they might have contracted this virus as early as late last year, October, or even earlier. So there's a lot of questions to be answered there. But Einar, I want to ask this question. While there are people, as I said, such as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva, while there are people who may worry about access to data samples, localities being provided or not provided by the Communist Party of China or the Chinese government, what are Beijing's concerns? Is there a way, really, for these field missions to be purely scientific and not politicized?
No, there isn't any way. I mean, no matter what Beijing does in terms of turning over samples and cooperating and places and all this thing, there will always be this fringe element. Unfortunately, some of them are in the White House. Pompeo will insist that there's information that was hidden. There are things we don't know. And I think that's the real lesson here. Speculating as to when this happened. This is what this scientific inquiry is about. They're going to trace it down just based on the data that they can get a hold of. And that includes anything that's coming from other countries, regardless of the time. They want to get to patient zero, not because it makes any difference. If it was started in the US or started in China or Africa, it doesn't matter. It's a global pandemic. It is affecting everybody. The key is, where did it start? How do we guard against it in the future? And this has a lot of bearing on the genetic makeup of this. We have the genome, but it's important to know how these things are crossing over.
Right, and also looking at the kind of politicization that has been placed on this issue surrounding the origin of the virus. I think it is in China's interest to have a scientific study look at it. Let's quickly take a look at some of the claims that were made by the Trump administration about the origin of COVID-19 since earlier this year. For instance, on April the 30th, US President Donald Trump said he seen evidence that gave him a high degree of confidence that the virus came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. On May the 3rd, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, "I can tell you that there is a significant amount of evidence that this came from that laboratory in Wuhan." And then on July the 3rd, just days earlier, Presidential Assistant Peter Navarro said, quote, "They, meaning China, spawned the virus. They hid the virus. They sent hundreds of thousands of Chinese nationals over here to seed and spread the virus before we knew." So the WHO has not said it has seen any such evidence, and the US has definitely not disclosed any. So Eric, what's the importance of joint field missions in terms of really grinding to the root of this issue and dispel any politicization of this issue?
Yeah, and I think the joint field mission is really key, because in certain ways, if China only conducted it themselves, many outsiders and foreigners and governments will not trust it. That's why a joint one, together with an international body, makes the investigation and its final conclusions that much more credible. And I think credibility here in any findings is really, really key. And I think that being independent of interference is also really important. So I'm looking forward to this investigation being truly independent of any political influence, especially when it's purely scientific.
Yeah. Well, in terms of access to data, there are areas that would be normally off limits in any country, but that would be important for finding out exactly the scientific root of this virus, such as military bases. I do not know. I'm just assuming. Can we expect, Eric, Einar, that countries such as the United States, which did not co-sponsor the resolution which calls for such a field mission, but eventually they did approve it, can we expect the United States, for instance, to exercise the same degree of openness and accessibility of data samples and localities that it is demanding from China?
Well, if you look historically, that's not going to happen. The U.S. always holds itself above any law. We have consistently not joined the ICC, International Criminal Court. We're not a member of the of WHO any longer. And I think a lot of that has to do with being able to discredit anything that comes out of even an independent study and say that this is all a conspiracy.
The United States has announced its decision to withdraw from the World Health Organization. So where does that put the United States in the field missions that we talked about, in the global pandemic review, response review that we just talked about, Eric? Because when this resolution was passed, the US was still part of the World Health Organization, but now it has announced that it's going to exit. It is exiting.
Yeah. Well, the US, having exited, will have lost its seat at the table. It will have lost its influence on the report. In certain ways, that's good and bad. But in certain ways, this Trump administration, regardless of the outcome, will likely politicize it, and given what we know about the Trump administration, will denounce it. It is almost expected. And so in certain ways, the rest of the world, as long as the rest of the world accepts it, I think that is what is really key, because the U.S. has lost its voice at that table, and hopefully it will rejoin again in a future administration. But in the meantime, I don't expect the Trump administration to have any positive response either way, regardless of how the investigation is conducted.
All right. Many thanks to Eric and Einar. We will keep a close watch on the situation.